Hello and welcome back to the channel during these very interesting times. On this channel I like to talk about negotiation and themes, and nothing can be more interesting, I suppose, to a negotiator than looking at the high level political games that are played, the jockeying of power between nations and power blocks for influence and the ability to affect policy and decision making. So of course, in recent times, everything has been turned on its head. Nothing is clear as it was. Russia has invaded Ukraine, and effectively when they did so, they ripped up the rule book. So what this really means is that the balance of power is shifting. And it's very hard to predict what that will look like. Only historians will be able to do that with any accuracy. So in this video, I thought I would talk about balance of power and what this means in a negotiation context. Now I'm going to have to be very speculative here because of course history is still being written as this video is being made. We don't know what will happen and what will change for the future. But I thought it'd be an interesting little dive into how things look at this point to me as a professional negotiator and what this could mean for the future in the way that countries will go forward. For anyone new to this channel, I am the collaborative negotiator. I'm a professional negotiator of over 10 years of experience, and I use this channel to talk about political events and negotiation themes. So let's start with a little bit of a look at some of the things that have been going on, and let's rewind a little bit as well. Let's start by talking about Germany and the German election, because in some ways this has been quite a roller coaster, and for anyone who's been following the political dimension, it has been very interesting to see just how everything in Germany have been turned on its head. The policies of Germany today are a million miles away from the policies of Germany only a month or two ago. So what happened is that a new coalition government, Merkel obviously retired, and a new coalition government was elected and formed. That coalition government had made various decisions or reinforced various decisions. So for example, they had the green agenda. They were going to be shutting down their nuclear power plants. They were completely uninterested in defence. So that was Germany that was trying to focus on technologies and things that matter to many Germans, as that coalition government perceived it. And this has been a sore point for other nations such as US and NATO for many years. It is no secret, and particularly under Trump, that the US have criticised Germany, for example, for being reliant on Russian gas and for not spending enough on their defence. Now the theory, or some of the underpinnings of what Germany's political consideration was for many years, was that they could influence Russia by trade, by having that dependency on gas, by making Russian reliant on German money, essentially, to try and stop Russia from doing silly things like invading Ukraine. That policy has obviously failed. And this is what the German government had realised, that this was the point they realised that their whole policy on how to fuel the economy, literally, and how to manage international trade, all of that was completely out of the window for them. So what this has meant for Germany is a complete seismic shift. And ironically enough, because of their previous decision, Germany was seen as a declining influence, still a major influence, but perhaps a declining influence in the EU. People weren't taking them credibly. They thought they weren't going to be pulling their weight, they were going to be insular looking and so on. As a result of the massive policy shift, Germany is now back in the forefront of European politics. It is now seen as a leader. The President of the US is calling Germany for decisions where perhaps before that might have been waning. So that has really changed Germany's outlook. They're not going to be happy. They're not going to be comfortable with the speed of change and the decisions that they have to make. And it's going to cost them. It's going to be painful in terms of changing, their policies, changing the way their economy works, the fuel it uses, the sources of supply, all those sorts of things. But they've taken this decision knowing that, and knowing that for them it is a moral decision, a decision they believe is right to do, and that they now have to cast away the baggage of the past. And it can be very interesting to see how that plays out. In parallel to that, we have seen French influence massively increase, particularly in the form of President Macron. He has long talked about the need to build relationships for a stronger Europe, particularly on the defence side of things. And most people thought Macron was a little bit of an outsider, an outlier on those issues. Yet history has done a bit of a funny thing of proving him right on this one. And he's not got everything right, far from it. But he has been at the heart of things, and he has been someone that's been seen to have pushed for a direction, and for that direction to have now been validated. So reportedly in France, he's about to go into a presidential election campaign with pretty strong polling suggesting that he's going to win. That French approval of how he has conducted himself is very high. And he is a pro-European. He is pro-EU. So he is definitely going to be pushing the agenda of a stronger Europe. And in line with Germany, whereas perhaps they might have been diverging, they are now converging. They are now coming together in agreement that there needs to be a stronger Europe, particularly in defence. And this is a huge change for Europe. So what this means, really, is that the EU now has a resurgence. President van der Leyen made a good speech in the Parliament of the need to support Ukraine, the need for solidarity and unity to stand up against aggression. Now, van der Leyen had had a bit of a rocky start to her presidency, but now she's looking a lot stronger, she's looking a lot firmer, and she's looking like someone at the heart of decision making, someone who's able to influence nations to pull together, which she hadn't been before. So, ironically enough, perhaps what Putin had done in Ukraine has bolstered her and given her the opportunity to exert influence and to be a deal maker. And the same for NATO. NATO had been seen as a bit on the wane for several years. It was seen as bureaucratic, perhaps a bit of an almost pointless legacy organisation. People really didn't know what to do with NATO. What was the point of NATO? All of those doubts have now been cast aside. Everybody now wants in to the EU and NATO club, because suddenly everyone wants to be there, part of the decision making, part of the collective defence and the collective policy making. And this is a shift in thinking that had never really been seen before at international level. What this has also meant, which is a little bit unusual and unique, it is very much a pivot east. And I'm not talking about a pivot east in terms of focusing on Russia, because of course that very much the theme during the Cold War. But a pivot east where both the EU and NATO look to countries like Poland as significant players. Now, Eastern European countries up to this point have not been seen as significant players, either in NATO or the EU. That has just changed. So those who might remember, or are perhaps a bit familiar with some of the European politics, Poland was actually having quite a lot of trouble with the European Union before this Ukraine crisis brought up. There was lots of reform, there was lots of things that Poland wanted to do that the EU did not feel was compatible with EU values and EU treaty obligations. All of that has been cast aside now. And Poland is now a pivotal country where arms are flowing in, refugees are flowing in, everyone wants to support Poland, and Poland is now at the hub of it all, at the hub of what the EU considers important. And perhaps, because Poland is one of the several nations that have been warning EU and NATO about Russia and Russia's aggressive intentions and what that means. And a bit like President Macron in some ways, they've been proven to be right. So this now means that countries like Poland have more influence in the EU, more influence than they did before, particularly as things were getting a bit acrimonious. They're also now at the heart of some of NATO's plans, that even talk of NATO and the US perhaps building a base, a permanent base in Poland. And that is a significant indicator of the strategic shift that has just gone on, and to the pivotal role that Eastern Europe is now going to play when it comes to EU and NATO decision making. So what else can we think about here? Well, let's talk about the US, because the US has of course always been a big player, particularly in NATO and defence. You know, the US spends 50% of the world's defence output, you know, the amount of money on defence. And that makes them obviously extremely powerful, militarily as well as economically. But on this one, the US have come under pressure in ways that perhaps it wasn't ready for. There's always been tension between the US and Russia, and that has now really come to the fore. And now it becomes a question of, over many decades, the US has called the shots when it comes to the moving of money, finance, global trade, the setting of the rules. You know, the US had been, if you didn't have the US support, you couldn't get many things done on, you know, various international organizations. That's how important they were. So now that influence is going to be leveraged towards sanctions, towards marginalizing Russia. And this is going to be a real test for the US, in that having built that rule, all those rules, all those at that infrastructure, whether politically or actual infrastructure, can that now be maintained? Can that be used almost as an economic weapon against Russia? And just as pertinently, can those same tools be used to make sure that China acts in a way that the international community in the US considers sensible, compatible, shall we say? And that's an interesting decision point that the Chinese are going to have to make. And I'll talk a bit more about China in a different context later. But this is a real test for the US in terms of supporting Europe whilst challenging Russia and China. And it's almost three fronts for them. And it's three very different fronts with very unique challenges. But what perhaps we can look at as well, not only that, but also the ability of the US to use its dominance to ensure everybody else stays aligned, particularly the Middle East. You know, the Middle East are influential in terms of the oil, in terms of decisions that they can make. So this is where the US is going to be using not just normal allies, you know, traditional allies like the UK, but we'll always align with US foreign policy as a rule. There are very few exceptions in this regards. But other countries who traditionally consider themselves more neutral normally push back against what US demands might be. So those allies, whether that be Switzerland, whether that be Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, whoever, those more neutral allies will now find themselves under pressure to take a side. And it'll be interesting to see, will they stay on the side of the US, will they lean more towards Russia, or will they try and stay rigidly neutral? And so that is a challenge for the US as well. And then of course, I do have the question of how relevant will the US be to the peace in Ukraine? And I ask that because it strikes me as a bit of a strange thing that Putin keeps talking about what the US does as being a threat to Russian security and so on in Ukraine. But actually US influence in Ukraine, apart from providing them military support for the last 8 years, hasn't actually been that significant. More has been on European influence. Ukraine don't see themselves as American. They see themselves as wanting to align with Europe. So when this war eventually comes to an end, as it must, in one way or another, then there's an interesting question as to just how influential can the US be in that particular part of the world. And it may well be that the guarantor of the peace won't be the US. It might have to be Europe. So this leads to the final question I have on this slide, which is Europe has recognised, perhaps, that even though right now President Biden and the US are supportive of the US, of the EU and Europe, will defend them, will meet their obligations under NATO, that is not something that can always be guaranteed. Because what Europe knows, or suspects even, I should say, no one knows for sure, is that after Biden, it may well be Trump might be back in the presidency, or some Trump-like clone, or his philosophy, his ideas, whatever person that may be. And so Europe knows that if that is the case, then the level of support they currently have from the US in terms of financial, in terms of military, and so on, might not be there. And so this is now an interesting and active conversation in Europe, is what does the future look like for them when they cannot call upon the US to support them in the way that they perhaps have anticipated in the past. This is why Germany is now massively increasing its defence spending. This is why the EU is now telling all its members they have to align their defence policies and their defence spending. They cannot just have a policy of the US will come into our rescue. That is no longer assured for them. And that is an active conversation that is happening. And that is symbolic. It doesn't mean that the EU, Europe, doesn't trust the US or doesn't want the US involved. Just a recognition that that dependency is not healthy and not sustainable. Now, of course, I am British. And so there's always a British dimension to what I do in these videos. And it's been very interesting to see how the UK has fared throughout this crisis. Because initially, the UK was doing reasonably well, actually, ironically enough. This is because, for once, Boris Johnson possibly made a decent decision, and he made an early decision. He was a leader, not a follower, in this case, and actually supported Ukraine militarily, well before anyone else was prepared to do so, apart from the US. But, and it's interesting to forget this sometimes when you live in the UK and you're exposed to British news, the reality is, and this is one of the benefits of YouTube, you can look at a whole variety of other channels. You can look at live feeds from Al Jazeera or France 24 or any other news outlet that likes to live stream onto YouTube that are not British. And one thing that struck me when looking at that news reporting was how little they were reporting on the UK. Yeah, Boris Johnson may have been in Poland or Latvia or Estonia or whatever, but that barely got a mention. No one really noticed. No one really cared. The UK was not seen as the influence, the decision maker when it comes to dealing with this Ukraine crisis. So what we're really seeing is that no one really looked to the UK for, what does Boris Johnson do, and that looks like being a good decision. I think it almost gives the impression that their default is whatever he decides should be treated suspiciously. And you can see that by the complete absence of the UK in foreign news reporting. So the most that we've seen of UK influence has actually been in Poland. And it seems to be that Boris Johnson and the Polish president have built up quite a good relationship. And so the UK being quite influential, quite prevalent in Poland. But that seems to be more the exception rather than the rule. And it was also noticeable that the Ukrainian president did thank Boris Johnson particularly for the arms supply support, to Ukraine, which had been absolutely instrumental to them in enabling them to mount the strong defence that they have. But that's been it. No one else seems to be thinking much about the UK and any other matter. So what this has also seen, bizarrely as it sounds, for those who perhaps not following some of the detail, Boris Johnson is still banging on about Northern Ireland Protocol, even in the middle of the Ukrainian crisis. And he is trying to get European leaders to support the UK's position on the Northern Ireland Protocol against the EU Commission. And everyone's ignoring him. No one cares. No one is interested in what London thinks about the Northern Ireland Protocol anymore. It is yesterday's problems, not today's problem. And so literally, the UK, and it's interesting, because there was very much a strong argument that the UK was using the Northern Ireland Protocol as a means of trying to leverage influence. Now that that is not the biggest problem on anyone's agenda, it is no longer a leverage. And so when Boris Johnson tried to drum up support for his position on Northern Ireland Protocol, nobody's interested. Nobody wants to support the UK. And the final point I want to make in this section is that the UK has really dropped the ball when it comes to refugees. I've talked about Germany having a resurgence in influence, and part of the reason why, because they have stood up and said, we will help refugees. This is very much a moral decision. And sometimes I should talk about it a bit more. But one of the important things in the ability to negotiate, the ability to exert influence, especially in the political arena, is that you need to occupy the moral high ground. You need to be seen as credible actors, people who do the right thing, perhaps, whatever that might mean. And in this scenario, Europe, the EU, Germany, France, all those countries have all stood up and said, we want to do the right thing, we want to help Ukrainian refugees. The UK stands alone in not doing that and being seen not to do that. And this is another reason why UK influence has been fatally undermined. Because, when people will look back to events like this, they'll say, yes, the UK did support Ukraine militarily. But the UK wasn't necessarily quite willing to go the step further, to take those moral decisions, to be there to help the people most in need, to be practical, if you like. And that's going to be noticed. And I think that's going to make the UK suffer for many years to come when it comes to the ability to exert influence on the international stage. So, of course, back to the main theme here, which is the EU. I jokingly could say that the EU Commission probably ought to send a thank you card to Mr. Putin. He has done something that no European leader can manage to do. He has united Europe. And they've never been this united. And it is so ironic that this has happened just as the UK had left. Or maybe it is because the UK had left. Maybe some people might want to make the argument that the UK was, one of the reasons why the EU was not united and in disharmony. And for anyone who's a fan of the Yes Minister series, that was one of the jokes in there in the episodes, that the UK just joined to make sure that Europe wouldn't join up against the UK. So ironically enough, history might perhaps validate that perspective, and that the EU has now united against a common threat. And we can see that the fact that so many countries now want EU membership, even though the UK had made this case to leave the EU, seems to be very much at odds. So the case for EU membership in the face of Russian aggression is there, it's obvious. And if you're a smaller state, particularly one in Eastern Europe, it is very obvious that you want to be a part of a powerful bloc that can support you and that will help you economically as well as militarily, particularly in this time when sanctions are flying about all over the place. So what we sort of have here in a way is a change in international thinking, where before all nations made decisions themselves, what's based on their interests. Now many nations want to be making decisions and influencing as part of a power bloc. Now, I said earlier, I mentioned China here, and this is important to mention, that China is looking rather weak right now. China may be a large, prosperous, powerful country with lots of potential. But I think one of the things that China has perhaps just realized from seeing what has happened to Russia, that China is not part of a power bloc like the EU or NATO or other things. Yes, they're trading blocs and China gets to exert influence in those. But China doesn't have significant defense alliances, doesn't have that level of support or integration that Europe and NATO has. And this is one of perhaps the lessons that can be drawn by many nations. It doesn't matter how big or powerful you are, on your own, people will gang up on you. And you can see that with Russia. Russia unilaterally invaded Ukraine. Yet suddenly now, Russia is screaming for allies. It's screaming for support from Belarus, from Syria, from Kazakhstan, and from China itself. Because Russia suddenly realized it is on its own. It is not part of a bloc. And China, I think, has also just realized that it too is not part of a bloc. And if you're not part of a bloc with lots of friends around you, then it's very easy for the international community to gang up and make you suffer. So this is why China has got this very difficult decision to make. Does it form a bloc with Russia and maybe a few other countries like Syria and Belarus, which aren't particularly influential countries? Or does it stay apart? Does it perhaps try and form a different bloc in the Asia-Pacific region? Maybe that's something they might need to rethink for the future. But right here and right now, EU and NATO are where all the action is at. The EU is not only seen as central to decision making, central to collective support, collective action. The EU is now expanding into areas that previously were forbidden to the EU. For all the past talk of a European Defence Army, that has been very strongly resisted by the EU member states. And this is what people have to remember, is things like national security and defence are not things that are easily or have been delegated to the EU. The nation states have retained their control because they see that as essential to their interest. So they've resisted EU expansion into things like defence and defence industry. That has now all changed. The EU, apparently, is now going to be providing 40% of the entirety of the European defence expenditure coming forward. That is how much money the EU is now going to pump as a result of what Russia has done. And with that money comes influence, comes the ability to set direction and set what happens next. So this is going to be, if you like, a new land grab for the EU. They are now going to be able to break into an area that had traditionally been shut off from them. So their power is going to increase, not decrease, as a result of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So what conclusions can we really draw? And what question do we have, I think? And it's going to be very hard to do that because things are still happening, things are changing at speed. So I can't necessarily answer this, I can only waffle and speculate to the best of my ability. But I think we will see whether US influence, particularly in Europe, is going to start to decline. The US has some big problems right now. That's problems of inflation, problems of debt, problems of having outsourced a lot of their manufacturing power to China. And they're going to want to try and reclaim a lot of that. But they're going to be wanting to do so right at the same time that essentially the EU is doing the same thing, or Europe, I should say rather, is doing the same thing. And everyone is going to be retrenching when it comes to their supply chains. Now going to be even more essential, particularly on the defence side of things, for all nations, that they can manufacture things in territories that they have very strong relationship with or is under their control. Now no one country can ever match the US, for example, in something like defence spending. But the EU can. And the EU can take everybody else's defence expenditure and pool it, if they're willing to do that. So, and that's not just in defence. On renewable energy, the Green Deal, on infrastructure, on manufacturing, on wage or labour reform, anything like that, EU and Europe is now going to have to think about how all of that works for them. And they will know that countries like Russia and China are unreliable partners with their own political agendas. They will also know that US politics can change very suddenly and abruptly and detrimental to their interests. So there's going to be this growing realization of the need for self-sufficiency. And it's very hard for any single nation to have self-sufficiency, but it's much more feasible to be part of a bloc that collectively creates self-sufficiency. And that is exactly what the EU is there to do, in a way. So I think the UK, the decision to leave the EU, it's going to turn out to be very interesting in terms of timing. They have left right at the time when the EU is now in a position to exert more influence, to exert more power, more control, and to leverage that financial, economic, political might to the benefit of the members. The UK is now outside that club. It is now a small island sitting outside one massive trading bloc and next to another big powerful neighbour, which is the US. Not able to significantly influence either, just tagging along. A bit like the small boy in the room who wants to be part of the group, but no one particularly likes him, no one particularly cares for their opinion, so they are mostly ignored. That is now the UK. And so many countries will be shifting, as I've said. And it won't be just within Europe and within NATO, influential and important as they are about to become, but even in the Asia Pacific, in the Middle East, they're going to start thinking, realizing that power blocks are important. Collective decision making, collective defense is going to be important, particularly when you have aggressive big countries nearby, like Russia and China, who have certain ambitions that don't match yours. So I think there's going to be, I think we're going to look back in history at what Russia did to Ukraine as a turning point. The same way perhaps the Berlin Wall coming down, the same way as September the 11th. Everything changed. The way people approach problems all changed as a result of those seismic events. And although it's very early days and we cannot, of course, draw conclusions, I think Russia's invasion of Ukraine is another one of those events that shifts the way everyone thinks and approaches problems. So I hope you found these musings of interest. Yes, I'm pleased to like and subscribe, and I look forward to seeing people's comments in the box below.